Welcome to session 3, and thank you, Peter, for that performance. It was actually I first met Peter a few years ago at a conference here at MOA when he did a performance it was many years ago now, before I started this project, and that performance is still resonating with me as well. So this session, having looked at archives, I suppose, was the focus of the last session. This one is more on various media and arts. And like Kate, I'll just read from the description. This session will explore the museum as a site of cultural contestation and issues of appropriation and commodification. How is cultural identity conveyed in art, by whom and for whom? We hope to explore a variety of perspectives. One view is that in dealing with Indigenous issues, non-Indigenous artists and researchers are simply engaging in metaphorical microcolonialism. That's a quote from John Corbett, African Rhythms and African Sensibilities. Alternatively, some see in cross-cultural collaborations the potential for a dialogue across the boundaries of oppositions, and that's Linda Smith, who we heard quoted earlier as well. As such, how do ethical considerations and artistic license coexist? Are issue-based and socially engaged artistic practice simply a less effective form of activism, or do they have a unique contribution to make in defining cultural identity and promoting recognition of the value of Indigenous languages? So these are a lot of questions and a lot of areas, some of which we've already touched on today, some of which we hope to develop a bit further in this session. So first, I would like to invite, we've changed the order slightly to allow Peter to catch his breath. I'd like to welcome Khelsilem Rivers, who was telling me a story about being given an award as 2010 Language Activist of the Year or something. He's born in North Vancouver, and I'd like to welcome him.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to briefly introduce myself in my language, since this is a symposium on language. Tanoia Ansekretos Tits Tanoia Siam Schochalten e Khelsilem Quian Sna Quian Khoshamen Hatlens Qualwens Quantquatnomiap Etis Quile Tits Heti Tameoch Chinheme ti 8 ewas quile quins quaquais tomiap not to make on it so to snitch and chip not to make on it so to schopmish oath it stalmuch oath snitchum amen eoch to stalmuch stalmuch e white to uns snitchum it snitchum eoch to stalmuch well e white quis welk what quals to westima to quis make on it so chit tit anuch chit to snitchum amen. It shouldn't come on told me up. The one Hotlands Quawins. Hello. That's what I said in my language. I said hello. It's a very long language to speak. No, I'm just kidding. I just introduced myself and said that my name is Schochalten, and as one of the names I carry, Khelsilem is another name that I carry that I received from my grandmother. I also come from the Kwakiwak people of the Numgis, or Lugwadau. My great-grandmother was Catherine Scow, a direct descendant of Sam Scow from the Numgis. And the name I carry on my Kwakiwak side is Akwasikan. So I just want to acknowledge my ancestry on that side as well. I've been fascinated in listening to a lot of the conversations today, so there's lots that I think at this point in the juncture where we're at, I feel more so of adding to and not initiating some of the points that have been raised, because I think there's a lot to be built on what's been said. So, and with the short amount of time, one of the things that we, one of my Danish friends has a joke, or not a joke, a Danish teaching, which is that he says that in the traditional Viking culture, you could speak for as long as you would want to speak, but you had to stand on one foot. And so the moment in which you had to start using 2 feet was the time in which you couldn't speak anymore. So it's a very good tool for keeping some of our very talkative and long-winded speakers that we have among our people, which I know many of our native people here know we have lots of back home. And I've been accused of it myself, so. Ironically, I don't identify as an activist all the time, primarily because I still don't know what it completely means other than to act, other than to do, but also to, cause attention to issues where there may not be enough attention at the moment. But the work that I primarily feel most compelled to do is community organizing. And so we have a phrase that my friend April Charlotte, who does language revitalization work in Montana with the Salish community where she's from, she said this thing that I think is very poignant and very true, and I keep in mind every time I'm doing work in the community, which is languages don't die in healthy communities. I'll say that again. Languages don't die in healthy communities. And I think what gets missed a lot of the time when we're doing this language revitalization work is how much of this work is actually community building. And I think anybody that does language revitalization work knows this to be true. Ever try and organize a community language class and see how quickly attendance drops after a month? Ever try and get elders to work together when that elder won't speak to that elder because of whatever reason? Or that community is from that place in the valley, and that community is from that place in the valley, and they won't talk to each other. Or, a lot of the historical trauma that's caused by residential school, where we have elders who are fluent in the language but refuse to speak it to anybody other than somebody from their own generation. So like I said, it becomes very evident for those that are working in the community that, there's a lot of unhealthiness in our community. Our community, is broken. The social institution of community is broken. And so a lot of our work is revitalizing community. I would say most of our work in doing, trying to revitalize our language is actually community. It's rebuilding community. I think the other aspect of language revitalization that I think gets missed, probably because there's no term for it, is that those of us that are, I think, my assumption anyways, those of us that are doing language revitalization work are actually not trying to revitalize languages. That sounds really strange to think about, but let me invite you into a train of thought that what we're actually trying to do is revitalize something much deeper than language. That language is just the vehicle in which we access that. So we're trying to revitalize community. We're trying to revitalize culture. We're trying to revitalize a way of being in this world that is unique to our place in the world. There is nowhere else in the world that has a understanding of what it means to be Squamish other than my people that are raised Squamish and speak Squamish. And that is unique to our place in the world, and that there's a unique understanding about that existence. And that language is just a way to access that. It's not the only way to access that, but it's one of the ways to access that. And so, we're doing language revitalization, but it's not the end goal. Our end goal isn't just so that we can be speaking to each other in this language that nobody else speaks. There's so many more other things than that. And when you talk to our elders, a lot of it is, the traditional knowledge, the traditional way of being, practicing these values that they have been taught and held onto for so very long. And those things are all important. So that's one of the concepts that I wanted to propose. The other concept that I wanted to propose is that we need to start innovating our strategies around language revitalization, because we're not succeeding. That's the other invitation to a train of thought that I'd like to propose, that we're not succeeding. We've been hearing for generations now that languages are dying, that Indigenous languages are dying. We've been hearing for decades now that these languages are going to go extinct. I come from a community where the First Peoples Council report on BC First Nations languages lists it as the third most endangered language in BC. And it said that we had 10 fluent speakers, but we actually had, I would say, closer to 5 or 6. So just think that. I have maybe 5 fluent speakers out of 3,700 people. And you go a little bit to the north, and you have Sechelt, and they have 2. So I think anybody that has more than 7 fluent speakers in your community, I'm very envious of you, because if I had at least 7, I would have 1 elder to visit every day. But I don't even have that. And so our work is very, we have a lot of work cut out for us. But one of the things that I think has happened is that the strategies in which we're employing are based around the study of language, not the study of how to build a community of fluent speakers. Those are not always the same thing. I can teach you all about the Squamish language. I can spend hours teaching you about the Squamish language, but you will not speak a single word of it. I can teach you all kinds of fascinating things about my language, but you won't actually be able to speak it. So talking about the language is not the same thing as speaking the language. And so much of the work that we're focusing on is learning to talk about the language, learning to understand the language, learning to be able to dissect the language, not actually building a community of fluency. And so I think that part of what we can do is, the community that is really has a vested interest in the revitalization of our languages and cultures, but also those that seek to support that work, is identify or come to terms with really clear goals and standards around what success means for us. For me, success means I can get to a place in my community where, community meetings are done in a language. I said this in my class recently. It would be like the band council hosting a general meeting in the community to decide if our community is going to sign an impact benefit agreement with Kinder Morgan to approve the expansion of a pipeline and oil tankers through our territory. Hosting that meeting and having that meeting completely done in Squamish language. The debate in that meeting, if it's all in Squamish, is going to be remarkably different than if it's done in English. That's where we need to get to. And so I'm very interested and very focused on fluency and building a community of fluency as a goal. And how do we get there? And what's the most efficient way to get there? Not quickest, but most efficient. Because sometimes efficiency doesn't mean quick. Sometimes going slow is actually more efficient. But what's the most efficient way we can get there? Because like I said, languages are dying. And at the present rate, they're going to continue to die. There are very few language strategies that are being employed right now that are actually successfully creating fluency. We have become so preoccupied with studying languages or studying languages so we can talk about them. So I kind of characterize that there's learning to speak the language or learning to speak about the language. And so my question that I ask people that I teach the language to when they want to learn it is, would you rather learn to speak about the language, or would you rather learn to speak in the language? And if you want to speak about the language, why not learn to speak about it in the language? If that's what we're really trying to go after, is learning to speak our languages, learning to have them be alive again, learning to be able to tell jokes in the language, learning to be able to tease people in the language, learning to be able to gossip and spread rumors about people in the language. That is a living language. And that's where we got to get to. And I'm very interested in strategies that accomplish that, because there's a lot of work that, as fascinating as it is, as interesting as it seems, as intellectually stimulating as it has become, there's some work that is not geared towards creating a community of fluency. And there's no shame in not doing that, but let's just be clear whether we're doing work that's going towards that or work that's distracting us from getting towards that, if that's what we're really about. So that's my invitation, to innovate in this work that we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next, we have Patrick Moore, who is an Associate Professor of Anthropology here at UBC.
Masi Janu, Masi CM Larry Grant, Daham Sniti John D. Dige, Zindathania, Yukon, Daha Dathania Tontido. Thank you to John and thank you to Larry Grant for welcoming us to this land and for also traveling with us to the Yukon long ago for language courses there. Siom Denadau Kaska Tagishu Denaza Zage Wofdekwa. I speak some Denada, Kaska, Tagish, and Beaver. And I'm going to talk about some insights relating to the topics that we're talking about today from the first language I worked with, which is Denada, and also the last language that I've worked with a lot, which is Denaza Zage, or Beaver. Tonte Northern Alberta, Zindathiau, Green, Denadahote, Tonte Denadazon, Oide, Ideti, Eduageda, Oide. A long time ago when I lived in Northern Alberta and was working there, elders would only speak Denada at that time. They didn't switch to English for people. So you were in the situation where you had to speak all the time with people, or you sat there all night and nobody talked to you in English. So there were these expectations for fluency, for using the language. As far as being regarded as an outsider, people didn't, if you tried to speak the language, people didn't really treat you as an outsider. If you were going to make an effort, they just kind of said, go for it. Even though they knew it's going to be hard for you, they're always encouraging, you know, and they kind of understand that you're not going to be perfect, but they would encourage you in that. And there were expressions. One of my colleagues who was a language teacher at that time used to say, which means, he translated as place no limits on yourself, and it means literally something like, don't make your own end, like don't put limits on yourself, like don't say you can't do it. Maybe you can do some of these things. And thinking back of things I can remember exactly what people said, we had this concept of art, like what is artistic and what are important things to have recorded in the culture. A lot of it has often stories, songs, important addresses. But the things that I can actually remember, I'm actually remembering the exact wording of some of these things, which I think are also artistry, but we don't think about them as artistry, which had to do with kind of humorous situations or embarrassing situations you found yourself in. And as I was thinking of these, I was sitting there thinking, what do I really remember? You know, this is now like 30 years ago. And some of these people have since passed on, but I can remember them very well. And I especially remember this one woman, who I think she's a true artist and a great sense of humor. And she always spoke to me in Denada. She didn't use English very much. And I remember we were at the post office waiting for the mail. Everybody would line up in the whole community. You had to wait and get your mail handed to you. And we were sitting there, so as I'm coming just by her, she was sitting there, she grabbed me like this and she pulled me down to her and she said, she's saying, you just love me because I have such big breasts. She said, and everybody in the whole community heard this, and I turned so red. She really enjoyed that moment. You know? And then the other time she really got me, I went over there. I was going to go over and visit her granddaughter, Gloria, and I was kind of waiting there for a while. They'd gone off picking choke cherries about this time of year. And I fell asleep on the couch. And then they came back, and she was the first one in the door. She always had a cane, too. She's walking with a cane. And I was just enjoying myself, napping on the couch. She's poking me with the cane. And I'd never heard her say anything in English before. She said, "Tup, lazy bugger," she said. But reflecting on some of these, I'm just thinking about all these interactions that you get in with people that maybe we don't record, maybe they don't go in your grammar, maybe they're not in your dictionary anywhere, but it's these kind of interactions where people are pushing you a little bit all the time, putting you on the spot. And we can't do all those things, at least yet, in kind of a digital environment, but it's something to think about, or in the museum. And we have to have that personal interaction. That's why it has to be there. It has to be that. And maybe there's a lot of learning that goes on with that, and a lot of the ways that things stick with you, right? On the other side, with the Denzel Project, we did a big project that Kate was also in. She's the person that organized it. And one of the amazing things about that project was the extent to which Tommy Atachi, who's a Denzel elder, kind of conceptualized and organized this project and integrated both traditional understandings and his own experiences with using media and working with anthropologists and linguists over 40 years. And I think what we were doing in a way was the same kind of respect that Denzel had for don't put any limits on yourself. It was a situation in which we also can't put limits on what other people may want to do with the media or with new technologies, or where the extent of their understanding of what can be done or what could be accomplished in using museums or media to accomplish some of their ends too. So what he did was really conceptualize the basis of what became a whole website project, because he had experience with video and with what are important things that people would be interested in representing their culture, going to the actual places, the experience of the places, all of his historic involvement with people that had trained him and his knowledge of the songs as a songkeeper and so on. So that was that perspective that I was thinking about. Those are the two aspects. That's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And we have Margery Fee now, Professor of English at UBC. Is Margery here? Ah, yes, sorry. Come on up.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Musqueam people and Larry in particular for welcoming us and me today. Also the organizers for inviting me, and it's been a great pleasure to meet so many people who are working so hard to revitalize their languages. Now, as a literature professor, I teach Indigenous literatures, and so of course, since the distinction between oral and written and literature and narrative is so unimportant in those cultures, it's been a necessity for me to come to grips with those things. But Larry was speaking about the poles in the Great Hall as kind of like Indian residential school children taken out of their context, and I thought about that, and I thought, yeah, I deal with those orphan texts. They're decontextualized, they're taken away from their original culture, and in fact that's true of all of them. It's not just Indigenous texts. I mean, something written in 1600 by a religious figure in my own culture is distant and foreign as well. And so one of the advantages, if it is an advantage we have in working with those kinds of texts, is we know some of the problems of understanding. We're not going to get it right. I mean, some of us pretend we know what they mean, but really it's not possible to know a whole other culture that comes out of deep roots and from a particular landscape for thousands of years. I mean, there's no way that I'm going to be able to get that in a lifetime even. So on that depressing note, nonetheless, I think there's something that we can do if we're careful and respectful. So yes, indeed, non-Indigenous critics are necessarily engaging in metaphorical microcolonialism, as the blurb on the leaflet said. Yes, of course. I mean, I can't jump out of my culture. And you hear me speaking. I'm doing it in a way that is typical of an academic in English and all the rest of it. And we heard other people speaking out of other contexts and other traditions. And I think here, I have to say, it's very heartening to see young people from Indigenous cultures who clearly, even when we're listening to them in English in this situation, bear the oratorical powers of their cultures. And I'm so impressed always that they're ready to say, what was it, just a little something? And they do so eloquently and so admirably. And so that is heartening, even if it's not done in the Indigenous language. So I've been lucky to have Indigenous students who will stand up in my class and, they'll speak to me quite directly and they'll speak to other students quite directly. And that's been, for me, a really important experience when I've been working with texts that I really am worried about. I'm really concerned that I might not be getting it right. Well, I'm not getting it right, of course. So there you have my dilemma. And I am, in part, as my duty, not only to be ethical in relation to Indigenous texts, but also to be ethical in my teaching. That is, my students expect to be able to come to my class, learn how to write in the conventions of my discipline, in the Western conventions, to succeed at that and to be able to use those things and go on with them. So it's not up to me to suddenly try to transform my teaching in a way that would leave them without those skills. So it's a lot of balancing. So I just want to try to give one quick example of the differences between what I've learned as the differences between my culture, my worldview, my learning, and that of Indigenous people around language. So I was taught, and I found it very enlightening actually, a model of communication that says, well, you need, a source, a speaker, say, you need a medium, airwaves, say, and you need a listener or listeners. So this is a very abstract, stripped down, narrow, decontextualized model. And there's nothing wrong with using such very narrow, decontextualized models for thinking. It's not bad to do that, but it's very dangerous if it starts to become your only way of thinking about language. Obviously, Indigenous peoples don't think about language like that, and in fact, very few people do, except academics. But I want to read you something that actually Patricia Shaw produced in a paper that I had the pleasure of reading. Thank you, Pat. I thought you might read this. It's something put out by the Assembly of First Nations about language in 1990, and this is what it says. Language is our unique relationship to the Creator. Our attitudes, beliefs, values, and fundamental notions of what is truth. Our languages are the cornerstone of who we are as a people. Without our languages, our cultures cannot survive. So that's a pretty heavy belief, and it puts heavy requirements on Indigenous people to do their best to undo the terrible effects of the monoculturalism of my own people, that the belief that there is only one good culture and it happens to be ours. Never believe anybody who says that of their culture, I guess, is the lesson. So we don't have the kinds of serious protocols that have arisen around some kinds of language documentation in English literature for the reason that I first explained to you. We believe that when a text is published, we can take it and we can read it, and that's our right. And so, of course, there's copyright and things like that. But we have to start thinking about how to do that kind of work respectfully, or in ways that don't insult the people whose work we're dealing with. It's very common in academic culture to be insulting as well as critical. And I think we have to teach our students that no matter how annoying or how wrong you think another interlocutor is, it's certainly your responsibility to point that out. But to be insulting is really a mistake. And the Indigenous people I've read and studied actually always seem to be invoking this idea. You need to be able to respect the person you're hearing, even if you don't agree with them. And I was moved and kind of amazed that, just as one example, that Louis Riel in the courtroom, who spoke there for 3 hours just before he was condemned to death, well, before and after he was condemned to death, constantly used the word respect. And one of the first things he said was to the judge and the jury, I respect you because you're doing your duty. You've been sent here to do your duty. I respect that. So that was striking in a man who had just been running an armed rebellion. But the other thing he did, which was so typical, was to say to the jury, which was half the size of a regular jury, because it was in the Northwest Territories, he said, I respect you, even though you're only half a jury. And everybody in the courtroom laughed. And you can imagine the stress he was under, and yet he was able to not only indicate his respect, but also joke. I thought that was a very powerful lesson in how the traditions of respect really do work. I mean, it didn't get him off, but he didn't descend to contempt or ridicule or to any of the other very common practices of our academy. Thank you.
Thank you, Margery. And finally, our last speaker in this opening part of the session is Peter Morin, who is a Tahltan artist and curator. And I met him recently in London, where he was doing some work, which I believe he's going to possibly talk about. But welcome, Peter. Slide on right away.
Yeah, let's put it on. Whew. I'm going to use part of my 5 minutes to get some water. Do it. Okay. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank the organizers for making some time available for me to share some of my experience around language and language learning and language practice. I want to thank the staff at the Museum of Anthropology for consistently setting the standard and pushing the boundaries. And making space for people like me to come into this location and problematize the role of museums in relationship to Indigenous cultures and Indigenous cultural practice. It's really an honor and a privilege to be able to come into a place like this, which has very mediated rules. Mediated rules? Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. Which has some sort of established rules, and then I get to sing to totem poles, and I get to call them Etsu and Etsia, and I get to say Nidischa Etsu Etsia. I love you, Grandma and Grandpa. And there's a power to that, which I think is really important. I want to thank the Musqueam people for being so generous and making a space available to me. And I want to thank Larry for making a space and setting us up in a good way for our time here together. And I appreciate that. Madhu Sugasanlat. I also want to thank our panelists here because they are sharing their good thoughts with us, and I am moved and changed by your words today. And as I go on with my day, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and hopefully tomorrow, I will carry some of the lessons today that I learned from you. Thank you. Madu Suga Sanla. So when I say Suga Sanla, I lived in Kaska Dene territory, and this was probably the start of my language journey, my language learning, language practice journey. So I was hired at Lower Post School, Denetia School. Something happens when you move from the city to a small community. Everybody is really excited that you're there, and they don't even know who you are. Hey, it's a young blood, coming into town or whatever, right? Like, oh, they got stuff to offer to us or whatever, right? And I'm an artist and a curator and all these sort of fancy things or whatever. But I also was an educator, and I worked with the Redwire Native Youth Media Society, and that was a whole trip. And so I was in town, Watson Lake, Yukon, and I got asked to interview for this job to teach language and culture to Kaska Dene kids. And my first response was, I'm Taltan. How do you do that? But then they had no one else because, but of course there was other people, you know what I mean? There's always other people in the community, and there's always people who have value in the language. But the thing is we get inundated with certain ideas about language, like, oh, language is dying. And it goes inside of us, like some of our panelists were saying. And that's a hard thing to deal with when you think every day you get up and you think, oh, my language is dying, so I'll never speak it. So why should I try? And then you think about the difficult political histories and difficult locational histories connected to the land that we're on. And you think about residential school, and it's really an interesting, So I really applaud all of the language warriors that are here with us, because it is a hard, hard job. And I hold you up, and I hold you in my heart. Thank you for your work that you do. So I was hired to do this job, and I realized that my own relationship, I was thinking, how do I conceptualize this? How do I work with this? Because I need to figure out my own language better. And at one point, how did I, or when did I break up with my language? You know what I mean? You're always in a love affair. We need to be in a love affair with our languages. Right? And some of us, some of us who haven't had an opportunity to grow up and be a baby in the language, you have to be a baby in the language. There's a reason why language is structured the way that it is. It's structured the way that it is so that you can grow up, you can make sounds, you can make mistakes, you can make jokes, and you can learn to love the language. But somehow I was 28 years old, and I had broken up with my language. And I was like, I went to the class, and it was a 2-room school, Denetia school. And actually Denetia, in the language, Dene is man or person, and Tia means good. And so language, Northern language, Taltan language, Kaska language is a practice language. So actually, because I became romantically involved with my language, I learned that it's actually an image, it's a movie. The language makes a movie. It doesn't make a description, right? And so what happened was I realized that Denetia actually meant person who does good, person who contributes good. And then later on I learned that was the word that we used for chief. Denetia. A person who contributes and does good for the community. And the only way that I was able to do that was because I started to be in a love affair with the language. But more than that, I was sort of implicated because I had to look after these kids, and I had to model a love affair with the language for these kids. And how did I, you know what I mean? Like, I wake up every day, I'm like, I listen to my language tape. I listen to my language tape. I'm able to phonetically repeat everything perfectly. I'm able to, like, read perfectly. I'm able to, like, you know, this is just sort of the way my brain works or whatever. I'm able to write it in the language, but I'm not able to actually make meaning yet. You know, that's kind of interesting. But the kids that were there, Kaska and Tahltan kids, were, you know, in a community where there was the history of a residential school. The residential school was actually there in Lower Post, BC. The residential school was actually standing, so kids walked by the residential school almost every day to get to the other school, you know. Very interesting and difficult political histories which we have to encounter as Indigenous people and as language learners and language practitioners. And I needed them to see someone like me speaking with meaning, with depth. And how the hell did I do that? How the hell do you do that? Do you know what I mean? When you're broken up with your language. 1 minute. This says, I guess 1 minute. Whoa. Anyway, okay, very quickly. So what I did was I'm an artist, and I realized that I needed to start developing the artwork with the language learning. I had to learn Tahltan language in order to learn Kaska language. And I'm not saying that I was a fluent speaker. I'm saying that I could speak with meaning in front of these kids. And we developed art making, which allowed them to practice the language. And I also decided that I needed to start making button blankets which embodied the words and you know, so I have blankets covered in feathers because I wanted to learn the word chush, and I wanted to understand that word. And I have blankets covered in, you know, buttons, and I wanted to learn the word edja, which means shirt. So I made a shirt for Sitting Bull on the back of a button blanket. And I said, an edja, to protect you from their bayonets. And then, so, like, I want to focus on being a language practitioner, to practice the language with meaning and with depth. So what I have to offer here is a new sort of idea, which is like singing the songs to colonization, singing our songs to colonization, but also putting ourselves. I was in London. Royal Holloway University invited me to 50 seconds. Royal Holloway University invited me to London to intersect with the mothership of colonization. And the way that I was able to do that was to put on the language. And I wanted to see what happened in my body when my body was practicing the language, and it was confronting this very strict colonial manifest destiny within London. And it went, my body, I did 14 interventions, and my body went from complete and utter panic, and I couldn't even make the sounds to the songs, and I don't know that many songs, to feeling like I was going to die. To feeling like I wasn't there by myself, that ancestors were speaking with me. To this is me declaring war on the British monarchy. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all the speakers. Wow, there was a lot in that, and I'm not sure I could summarize it sufficiently, but hopefully the conversation will get going. There were lots of themes that came out there. One of the things that struck me about what Margery was saying about and Peter, in a sense, about insults and respect in relation to language, and also what Peter was saying about attitudes to language. I was reminded of a email exchange that Mark Turin forwarded to me the other day about an exchange that was going on about the use of a coffin in the context of endangered languages as a kind of symbol, I guess, on a website or something. I can't remember what it was. But that kind of attitude of outsiders, for example, coming into a community and sort of declaring that your language is dying and sort of we're here to help kind of thing. But the other thing that I maybe people can start off discussing that is the role of different mediums, maybe in terms of written literature, in terms of, I think, Patrick, you've been involved with radio a bit, and film, performance, that kind of thing, and what kind of role these have in this difference between, as Khelsilem was saying, talking about a language and speaking it, and what role these various media have in that.
Hello? Here we go. I guess I can take it off and now to put it back on. I think, well, depending on the context of the language, it definitely varies, because you employ strategies with certain mediums and you don't have the audience to, properly provide that medium for. So, for example, if I was going to get a bunch of people together and design a Squamish language newspaper and do all kinds of nice graphic layout and articles and stories, and it's all in the Squamish language using our orthography, and then we print 2,000 copies, there's nobody that can read it. And it's not going to serve anybody right now, at least. But, if there's 1,000 speakers, then something like that would actually be useful. And then if you have a community that's spread out geographically, whereas my community is, relatively close, if you have a community that's spread out really geographically, mediums like radio, where you could broadcast it potentially over that wide geography, would actually be really useful. Where you could constantly have language being spoken on the radio, so people at home with relatively low cost to access it are there. The one medium that I find that's getting a lot of attention, deserved or not deserved, I can't really say yet, because I kind of feel that there isn't enough evidence in my mind to support the belief that it actually helps revitalize fluency in communities. And there's a lot of attention on apps. And they're really cool, they're really neat, they're really fascinating. Technology is really cool, and I think, one of the tropes that I hear a lot, and as a young person I kind of get sick of it, is, young people, they all have iPhones and iPads, so if we just make language apps, they'll learn the language, and we'll save it that way. And I find it to be a really kind of ageist attitude around, what young people actually think and what we actually do and what we believe in and how we actually interact with each other. But, yeah, I don't know if there's any evidence that apps revitalize fluency. They're really cool, and they can be really cool. I know some people that have made really fascinating language apps. I have a friend that made a Ojibwe language app that you can translate and actually breaks it down by the verb structure and the suffix structure and everything, and you can input a phrase and it'll translate it for you. And there's all kinds of other apps that are coming out, really cool, creative stuff that a lot of young people are coming up with apps, especially as the technology changes with way phones are going or other technology. But like I said, there's, the medium needs to support, depending on what our goal is, the medium needs to support that. But we also have to be conscious that we're not spending too much time on certain mediums, creating stuff for certain mediums, if it's going to take away from actually succeeding long term. So.
I just wanted to say the love affair with the language is such a wonderful way to put it, because that's how languages are learned. You fall in love with your mother, your family, your relatives. You also fall in love with the concept of being able to say cookie and getting a cookie. It's obvious little kids are so highly motivated for all kinds of reasons, and somehow we have to be able to make that love for, in my case, not just language, because I don't teach language, but for the idea that there are cultures that are different and unusual and fascinating and absolutely worthy of every kind of possible attention and support.
In my experience, too, the media that work are things that fit the situation. So in that first community where I was living, they initiated a successful community radio station where people just turning in, listening to the news, but there are lots of fluent speakers. The same thing probably, well, they had community radio stations in the Kaska communities and they didn't continue. They had problems with staffing. I think they didn't have the kind of audience, either the numbers of people that could just listen to fluent broadcasts. They probably didn't have enough people even to do the broadcasts of younger people. So I think a lot of media can be kind of a distraction if you're putting too much time into it. But people may be pondering, how do you generate the interactions if people aren't already doing that? How do you create the situations? But I think we do have to be more creative about the situations to have, interpersonal interactions where people are just talking to each other and creating situations where they're going to use language.
Microphones. I'm just like, woo. Too many jokes. I think, well, I'm in my work or in my life or what I endeavor to do, I think the word media is a very interesting thing because, Aboriginal languages, Aboriginal cultures are all they all interface with each other. All these actions interface. So the creative practice is designed to also convey language and language structure and language meaning, and the created object also it speaks the language. It's created by the conveyance of structure and meaning. And it speaks a certain kind of language, which I'm interested in. So we talk about media, right? Contemporary media and all of these things. But there's also these older, more established practices like basket making, which also has its own rules. And if we think about what happened with the residential school? Well, the residential school interrupted the conveyance of the traditionally based knowledges and how they would be spoken. But what we do have is we have the art, the making still. You know what I mean? I don't understand why we're constantly putting a separation between these two things. There was a time when I took kids I used to work with Aboriginal kids in foster care, and with a group called Surrounded by Cedar Child and Family Services, and it was my endeavor to take kids to the museum to see objects. And I would say to them, like, you're Nochanalth, and I'm not. And these objects are also our grandmothers and grandfathers. So they're going to speak to you in a way that they're not going to speak to me. And this, I want to, the creative practice decenters certain binary structures which we kind of easily fall prey to these binary structures, right or wrong. We won't speak the language, we will speak the language. But what if everything we do is speaking the language? What if we decenter that binary so that actually we're here right now, how we're speaking right now, how my body is moving right now is speaking and conveying meaning in Tahltan Nation knowledge. How we interacted with totem poles together today is structured by Tahltan Nation knowledge. And to me that seems very, much more friendly, You make a drum and the drum is the speaker of the language. And you and the drum speak the language together so that you're not alone. Yeah.
I'm aware of the time drawing to a close, but we do have time for some questions and or comments, and I'm also aware that speakers from earlier sessions are in the audience and may want to add something in relation to what they talked about earlier. So any questions, comments? That was the first hand I saw.
I just wanted to comment how great it was, and even just earlier, it was, just watching you singing and drumming, it felt like it really had a great feeling to it, and even the totem poles could speak what would you say. Just wanted to really be thankful for today's symposium, and maybe with all kinds of documentation, is there some way to blend the traditions and even the oral, the histories with digital.
I have a comment about the emotional journey of particularly First Nations people relearning their own languages. That it's beyond overwhelming, and the whole idea that has come across to me of living our language, that me learning my language puts me in touch and connects me over thousands of years of time, hopefully if we're doing it right, to how my ancestors thought, to how they lived, to how they would feel and respond to things. And then you add to that the whole reality of technology and media to something that's already overwhelming. And I think that in itself is another kind of side shoot journey of learning to balance the traditional way that we used to learn things that might have been challenging, but it was also soothing, and it confirmed to us who we were and comforted us in other ways. So trying to find a place of comfort in all of this seems almost impossible at times, and I think that's what things like this are for, and being here, supporting each other, listening to what each other has to say, whether we agree or disagree. I came here to learn, but I found I was comforted. So I want to say thank you to everybody who's here and shared today, because it's been an amazing experience.
Thank you. Is there anyone who wants to respond to that, or should I speak for something?
I just want to say that, like what I do, everybody can do it. Everybody can go to the Buckingham Palace and declare war on the British monarchy. Yeah.
Sign me up.
And we do that with language, because the language, the thing that is scary and frightening, and which we have to, we talk about love affair of the language and stuff like that. But language is really power, and we feel uncomfortable because we're uncomfortable with, understanding or feeling that power, because we haven't felt it. It's a colonial enterprise. We live within a colonial state, and which is about silencing and silencing and silencing and silencing and silencing. And so we have to be okay with the uncomfortableness as well. We have to be okay with how difficult it is to speak. We have to be okay with it. And sometimes I'm okay with it, and sometimes I'm successful at it, and sometimes I can speak the words. And I just, for me, I just pay attention to what those things are, and then maybe I make a button blanket. Anyway, thanks for sharing.
Any other questions, comments? It's been a long day, I realize. Anything else? Anyone else want to add anything? Okay, well, I will just again thank Larry and the Musqueam people for welcoming us here today. And I think Kate was going to make a few closing comments.
Just want to say thank you to all of our participants for traveling from afar and from the local area, for all of your comments, all of your questions, all of the participation has been what has made this into a very productive and provocative day that I think we'll all be thinking about for a long time. So I think we can give everyone a hand, and to yourself, thank you so much. I also want to thank again the sponsors that have allowed us to bring everyone together, from the University of Arizona, the First Nations Languages Program, the Department of Anthropology here at UBC, the University of the Arts London, the School of Interactive Arts and Technology at SFU, the Irving K. Barber Center, and of course MOA, and special thanks to the MOA staff for everything they've done to make this day possible for us. So once again, thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing the webcast online, and I really appreciate the documentation work that's gone on, because so often these events end and it's hard to follow and sort of be reminded of everything that has been discussed in a day. So we really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you so much.